In this presentation, I'm going to talk about client access restrictions in Select Server, not about the details of client access restrictions themselves, but about some fundamental things that you need to understand about networking, in order to use the exceptions, in order to define exceptions for client access restrictions using IP addresses and host names. As you know, those are the two possible ways to define the exceptions for client access restrictions. This is very different. The client access restrictions and how they work for Select Server Online and for a deployed Select Server. That's very different because of how networking functions. Let's start with the Select Server Online or hosted Select Server. I have a custom activation group on a Bentley site on hosted Select Server. Here it is, which has client access restrictions enabled, and it has some exceptions. I will now disable these two, and I will only leave the dummy exception enabled. This is in order to enable access restrictions at all, because as you see in this note, if there are no exceptions defined, that the access restrictions are not enabled. So I have my license management tool on my machine. Here it is, configured to look at this custom activation group, at this site, let's say. SelectServerBentley.com and the site activation key of this custom activation group. Now, as I disable the exceptions, I will refresh license management tool, and it will say that the client doesn't have access to this site. It means that client access restrictions work, as I only have the dummy exception, and there are no other exceptions letting my PC to use the licenses from the Select Server. You see, it says we don't have access, but if we go to Tools Options and Test Connection, it does it correctly. So it can talk to Select Server. The Select Server doesn't let it access the licenses. Now, regarding client access restrictions in case of hosted Select Server, it's actually very limited. This function is very, very limited in case of Select Server Online. Why? Because you cannot, one very important thing about client access restrictions, Select Server never knows the host name of a PC that is asking for a license. It only knows the IP address. That's the most fundamental thing to understand. So on the hosted Select Server, if you try to add a new restriction and you choose the hostname or machine name, it says that it's not recommended, and actually almost never it will work. It will only work in case if your hostname is resolvable in World DNS system, and usually the internal host names of the company's PCs is not visible to the World DNS system. So it's not possible to find out the host name from an IP, because, as I said, the Select Server doesn't know the host name, so it gets a request for a license. It sees the IP, and then it tries to look to reversely look it up in the DNS system. And of course, it will not be able to find an internal host name of a PC. That's why it's not possible to define exceptions using host names here. Regarding the IPs, it's also problematic actually, because I will show one picture now. This picture explains the network address translation. You see NAT host, and NAT is the short for network address translation. Almost all of the companies use it because of the number of IPv4 addresses almost exhausted. I mean that IPv4 has a limited number of IP addresses, and it's not possible to assign every device in the world a real IPv4 address, and that's why companies have internal IP addresses, many internal IP addresses, and then the network address translation changes them to an one or maybe two or three external IP addresses. In this case, I mean, when an internal PC wants to talk over internet to some other device, it first contacts NAT, and then NAT passes the traffic to internet, having substituted the internal IP address with the external IP address. So let's imagine a company has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 PCs with internal IP addresses there underlined with blue line, and all of those 7 PCs will appear to an external device to which they are talking to as having the same external IP address that is substituted by NAT. So that external device may be the hosted select server. So the IP that hosted select server sees is the external one, and it usually it's the same for all the company PCs. So there is no way to distinguish between the internal machines. And I will now demonstrate that because here my machine also has an internal IP address, which is 10.228 and so on, and it has an external IP address that is given by NAT, 82.135 and so on. I've created both exceptions, I mean 2 exceptions using both internal and external IP address. So first of all, I will enable the one with the internal address, and I'm going back to the license management tool, refreshing it again. It still doesn't give me access. The client doesn't have access to this side because select server, the hosted select server has been contacted with a request for a license, but the IP that it saw, it was my external IP, not the internal one. So this is useless. This exception is useless. If I enable the exception with my external IP address, then it should work fine. Refresh, and you can see that I started seeing the licenses, and now my machine would be able to use the licenses from the hosted select server. So the bad side is that usually in this case you cannot separate the company's computers, one part with access to licenses and the other part without, because there is no way to distinguish. But there is still a little use here. At least companies can configure the client access restrictions and set the external IP address. In this case, all the machines from within the company will have access to the licenses, but if, let's say, an employee goes home and takes the site activation key to his home PC, which of course will have a different external IP address, then in this case he will not be able to use the license from the hosted select server. This is kind of security measure if you want only, I mean, if you want to make sure that, sorry, only the PCs within your company will have access to the licenses. So those are the limitations of hosted select server client access restrictions. Now I will show a deployed select server. I have it installed here on my machine. Again, here I have a dummy restriction. Just a second. I need to refresh that. client access restrictions in this office, and here restrictions are enabled, and I have a dummy restriction just to keep them enabled, and all the real exceptions are disabled now. But here I already have one exception defined using my hostname and the other one using my IP address, internal IP address, because now in the case of deployed, as deployed select server is in the same local area network, of course it's seeing the internal IP addresses, not the external one. And in case of deployed, the client access restrictions can be used now without limitations. You just choose the way you want to define exceptions using host names or IP addresses, and both work. So I'll demonstrate it now. Now I disabled the real exceptions, so first I will reconfigure my license management tool on my machine to use this server. Okay, and use the correct site activation key. Testing connection. It's fine. It can talk to the deployed select server, but it doesn't have access, of course, as we didn't enable the exceptions. Let's enable the hostname exception. And let's check it again. You refresh. We already have the licenses. Disabling it. Checking again. No access to licenses. Now enabling the exception defined using the IP address, the internal IP address, and showing that this is also working. So now there is access to licenses, and either method of defining exception can work in case of deployed select server, as you see. So thank you for your attention. That's pretty much I wanted to tell about that.